theme tonight, again, I appreciate Mary and his kind words, and I've tried to figure out when I came here and I can't do it either. I just showed up on it, I guess. Our theme is the church is in the world, but the church is not of the world. And there is a world of difference between those two little words, in and of. I would not go into that, but this whole lectureship has to do with that. Our subject tonight, and again, we're going to be a little we're late getting started, the church and the civil government. So there'll be not a lot of scripture, but we do have some. And we'll start off with Jesus' words in Mark 12:17. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marvel at him. And people are still marveling at him. But Jesus in this obligated us as people of this life in two areas. He said, first of all, render both to Caesar and to God the things that belong to each. Render is to deliver or discharge what is due. And so we have an obligation in this, and so Jesus has obligated us in these two different areas or spheres because they are two different kingdoms. But he obligated us to both. One is physical while the other is spiritual. When Jesus was talking and questioning by Pilate, he said, my kingdom is not of this world. He came to establish a kingdom, but he said, my kingdom is not of this world. His king, he stated that his kingship is not a rival to the kingship of Caesar as it pertains to things of this world, physical things of this world, and they were concerned about. My kingdom, or if my kingdom were of this world, if my kingdom had the nature of kingdoms of this world, then would my servants fight that I should not be delivered to the Jews. And so he demonstrated when he told Peter to put up his sword that there was a difference between the kingdom he came to establish and that which was already established, that of the Roman Caesars. But he said, if my kingdom were of this world, then my kingdom would act like other kingdoms of the world. And it is the nature of kingdoms of this world to engage in carnal warfare. But it is not the nature of the kingdom of Christ. Now with that introduction, we will go to the subject, the church and civil government. We want to learn a little bit about the civil government because we have to live with it as individuals and as the church. And we'll find sometimes that's not always easy. But first let us understand that government itself is ordained of God in Romans 13:1 and following, and we'll notice verses. Paul wrote, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, and that is government. For there is no power but of God. Now be it a good government or a bad government, government is of God. The powers that be are ordained of God, and ordained is to arrange in an orderly manner. That's the obligation of government. Do they always meet their obligation? No. Are they always what God would have them to be? No. But God designed and knew that it was necessary that man have a government by which we could live in this world in an orderly manner. And that is one of the obligations of government, that provide the citizens that they can live in an orderly manner, because that is the idea of God being ordained. In verse 2, whosoever therefore resisteth the power or the government, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Ordinance here means arrangement, that is institution. And so we're talking about the institution of God. If you resist the power of the government, then you are resisting an institution of God. God established that. It has a right, it has a need. Again, it also, of course, has obligations. In verse 4, for he is the minister, and this is the same word we get our word deacon. And I was thinking on the way up here, and I was keeping on working. Could we say that the government is the deacon of God? I think it might convey a little more of the obligation in which the government has as it relates to God. But it is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, or he beareth not the sword in vain, meaning that the government has the right obligation to punish those who do that which is evil. For he is the minister execute wrath upon them that doeth evil. Again, his obligation is to punish those who do evil. Verse 5. Wherefore, ye must needs be subject. And that word here is be obedient. Not only for wrath, that is, in case if you do wrong, you're going to get punished, but also for conscience sake. Since they are ordained by God, then if we're going to have a good conscience toward God, then we must be obedient to the governments. Verse 6. For this cause pay you tribute also, for they are God's ministers. And here he used a different word than the word diakonos. Here he used a word that means a public servant. That is, a functionary. And so government then is a public servant of God, or a functionary of God. It has a God-given role to fulfill. As the family does, so the church does, so does the government. Attending continually upon this very thing. That is their God-given obligation. It needs to be understood as we look at this. It is not a particular ruler or government or even sovereignty that God ordains, but as I express it, the genius of God. When I sent this out to Marion to check, he asked me what I meant by genius. So I thought, well, I better put that in. Here's what I mean. The genius of government is that God ordained it. If God ordained it, it's necessary. It is the servant of God, and it is that gives civility and order by which God's people, or all people, can live and serve God. That is something in which God has ordained the government to do, and there is a genius in that. It didn't come from man, it came from God. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, Paul says, therefore, I exhort therefore that first of all supplication, prayer, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men. And then notice what he says. For kings and for all that are in authority, that, here's the reason we are to pray for our governments then, that we may lead a quiet and peaceful life in godliness and honesty. Our government should make it possible then that we can live a peaceable life of godliness and honesty. So government has some obligations, it has some responsibilities, and we are to pray that government would meet those obligations. Second, let us understand the role of civil government. Civil implies that which is civil or civility, if you will. It belongs to and is rendered to the government, and may I also add here just humbly, government owes civility to its people. And we don't always get that. But it is a God-given obligation, because this is what government does. As its citizens owe civility to its government, the government owes civility to its people. What is civility then? Civility is about more than being merely polite. That's good. And it's a good and excellent place to start. Civility fosters a deep self-awareness, even as it is characterized by true respect for others. Think of that in what's going on now in our country. We don't have a lot of civility. Civility requires the extremely hard work of staying present, even with those with whom you have a deep-rooted and perhaps fierce disagreement. And certainly we have that today in our government. But we are to stay present. And we are to be civil, even in spite of all that. It is about constantly being open to hear, to learn, to teach, and even to change when necessary. This is the idea of civility. This is what our Congress, meaning the House and Senate, and our President ought to be today. It ought to have some civility. It seeks common ground as a beginning point for dialogue when differences occur, and they always do. While at the same time recognizing that differences are enriching. How would we know what is a better idea unless we debate it? And so it is enriching. Civility is patient and strength of character, without which government cannot work. And certainly we are seeing some of that today. Now let's look at civil and moral. There are differences between the two. Government is obligated in one, and God God expects the other. Civil or civility belongs to government, and morality or moral belongs to God. Now sometimes they are exactly the same, but they are titled differently because they are in different spheres. While it is not the function of government or civil government to legislate morality, but rather what is civil. The civil authorities are the powers that enforce certain moral principles, though they do so through civil law. For instance, murder. It's against God's will and it's against the government. Perjury, thief, or theft, rape. Not as God's commandments and morality, but as civil laws enacted by the government. If it wants to be civil, and it has a God-given obligation to be civil, but it does so not as violations of civil law. It does so as violations of civil law, not as moral. Now let's understand the difference then briefly. Let's take a case in point. A man rapes a woman, but then he obeys the gospel, and God forgives it. If the obligation of government would be the same as that of God, then the government would be obligated to forgive. But what does civil government do in such a case? And there have been cases. We have known the cases. It being the case that God has forgiven the one who committed the immoral act of rape, how may civil government rightly punish him? You see, if civil government were enforcing morality, which is God's area, then they'd have to do just as God did, forgive. And send the man home. Shall the civil authority forgive and set the man free, the rapist? No. Because civil government is responsible for enforcing civil law. Since forgiveness from God is not something visible, you can understand that anybody could claim, well, I have been saved, and since we don't have any government law to determine what is saved and what is not, or who is and who is not, anyone could claim, I'm saved, God forgave me, therefore government is obligated to set me free. No, because government operates in one area, in civility, God operates in another area, moral. So we may render the same obedience, or we may violate the same thing, or do the same thing. God may forgive if we obey the gospel, repent of it. Civil government will still have an obligation to punish because it's civil. While God works in the spiritual realm, the government works in the physical realm. And it has certain obligations then to fulfill. And one of them is to punish evildoers, if you remember. Forgiven or not forgiven by God. Because it operates in a different sphere. In a different category. And therefore the rapist will be punished by civil authority. Well, it may be that the rapist obeyed the gospel as had been forgiven by God. So I hope that makes a little distinction, because sometimes we get confused. And I say in the past, I have been confused as well. Now third, the Constitution and the amendments are authority for our civil government. Sometimes you hear things that you wish they hadn't been uttered just yesterday. Not get into politics, but I'll just identify the person because you know. The mayor of New York City said that we were going to have to start reinterpreting the Constitution, or change the way we look at it. And what does that mean? Basically, it means pay no attention to it. So we need to know about the Constitution as it relates to the church, what we're covering. Informing this nation, our founding fathers wrote the Constitution of these United States on September 17, 1786. Followed with the Bill of Rights on December 16, 1791. The First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States reads in this fashion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to peacefully assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. I wish we had men today who wrote the Constitution and the amendments to the Constitution. This is a beautiful First Amendment. It says Congress, and that's important. Establish. It clearly means that the government may not establish a national religion. Coming from England and fleeing from England, in fact, this is one of the things in which they were most concerned about. They did not want government establishing religion. They left that in the king. They didn't want it. First Amendment. It also means that Congress may not pass a law that favors one religion or sect, religious sect or group over another. However, the court has gone far awry from the meaning of the First Amendment, in my opinion. But that's what it means. Congress. The United States court ruled that public school, now this is how it's changed now. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that public school teachers cannot lead their students in prayer. Now, whether you like that or don't like that is not the point. It's that the Supreme Court said. The court reasoned that teachers leading students in prayer would place a coercive pressure upon the religious minorities and make it appear that the government, and when you read government, think Congress, supported a particular religion. Now, how do you get from Congress to a school teacher? Well, that's a mystery to me. And we'll follow that. The word Congress. What does it mean? Many times when we hear the word Congress, we think of the House. Not true. The Constitution itself defined the word Congress. And I meant to bring me a copy of the Constitution. I have several. And I would that every member of the church had a copy. They're not very big. They're not as big as the New Testament. The Constitution itself defines the word Congress as the Senate and the House. The word Congress refers to nothing else as far as the Constitution and carrying out the laws and the restrictions that are placed upon the Congress. It doesn't mean a school teacher in Texas or Oklahoma. It means Congress. Remember, the Supreme Court has no authority to make law. The Supreme Court did when they restricted the school teacher from leading her class in prayer. Why? Because she was on state property? Funded maybe by federal government funds? I always like it. Again, I'm not trying to be too political. The government takes money from the states, takes it to Washington, shovels it around and sends it back, but it always sends it back with strings. They don't get it with strings, apparently. But they send it back with strings. You do this or that and such, or else you'll lose it. But Congress is not the teacher. Congress is not even the state of Oklahoma. Congress is the Senate and the House, and that's all. That's all the word means in the Constitution. Originally, the First Amendment applied only to laws enacted by Congress. Originally, this is the way the law was understood as written by our founding fathers. Only applied to Congress. It didn't apply to the school teacher. It didn't apply to the states. It applied to Congress. They cannot. However, starting with the case of Gitlow versus New York, the Supreme Court has applied the First Amendment to each state. This was done through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. I wish we had time to get into that, but we do not. It's kind of like people in the religion world. They take one passage and say, that kind of restricts me, so I go off to another and put one passage against another. Well, that's kind of the way it works. That's not the way it's supposed to work. But that's what they did. But remember, this was, the word Congress was not applied to somebody else until this case took its place. understand by the words of those who wrote it. That is, how are we supposed to understand the Constitution and the Bill of Rights? Well, to understand the people who wrote it. It helps. Thomas Jefferson in 1808 said this: "Whenever the words of a law will bear two meanings," and that's often the case with words, "one will give effect to the law, and the other will defeat it." So you're kind of having a dilemma. Which one do you take? He said the former must be supposed to be or have been intended by the legislature, those who wrote the law, because they would not intend that meaning which would defeat their intention in passing the law and in a statute as in a will. The intention of the party is to be sought after. Just as we read the Bible, we want to know what the writer intended. And so we want to know what the writers of the Constitution intended and the Bill of Rights. That's from Jefferson. In 1823, some years later, Jefferson said, "Laws are made for men of ordinary understanding, and should therefore be construed by the ordinary rules of common sense." I wish we had more like Jefferson. People handle the Constitution, again, the same way they handle the Bible. They forget what Jefferson said. This meaning is not to be sought for in a metaphysical subtlety, but may make anything mean everything or nothing at your pleasure. That is, if you're not going to get the meaning intended by the writer, then you can make it anything you want to. And when the mayor said we got to change our way of interpreting the Constitution, this is what he means. Make words mean not what they were intended, but anything we want them to make or to mean. Jefferson understood. He was part of it. In other words, not at its pleasure, the court or some lawyer using all of the less obvious meanings of words, or a fine distinction between words, as in pushing the meaning farther and further out from what the intent of the writer meant. You can do that, you know. And pretty soon it means absolutely nothing. So how did we get so far away from the meaning of the words of the Constitution? From the words of the First Amendment, which states, "Congress shall make no law respecting or an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." How do we get away from that? It prohibited Congress, no one else. Congress. So now that states are under the same words. It changed because the court, and I tracked this down, but I can't give it to you, don't have enough time. The court actually changed the meaning of the word Congress to mean the states, to mean the school teacher in her classroom. And they took these words and applied it to the states, and they applied it to the teacher in the classroom or other places. They had no business doing so. That was not what the intention was, because the Constitution defined what the word Congress was. As I said, it is the Senate and the House. Prior to 1890, the Bill of Rights was held only to apply to the federal government, not the states, not the teacher. Prior to 1890, a little over 100 years after it was written. Under the incorporation doctrine, most provisions of the Bill of Rights now also apply to the state and local governments. That means a city. My little town, city town of Seminole. By virtue of the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. I hope I'm interested you in the 14th Amendment. Go home and study it. Because that's how they nullified the First Amendment and its restriction to the word Congress. The United States Supreme Court in Reynolds versus United States in 1879, remember we were 1880 just a moment ago. In 1879, the court wrote that Jefferson's comments, a wall of separation between church and state, been used by the court before this time. They were obscure in a letter in which he wrote, and we'll get to that. But it goes on, may be accepted almost as authoritative declaration of scope and effect of the First Amendment. What? Jefferson's words. The man who said, let words mean what they mean, paraphrasing. His words are now used, and let it be understood, these words are not in the Constitution. And he was not discussing the Constitution when he wrote these words. But the court says they are almost as an authoritative declaration to the meaning of the First Amendment. Separation of church and state. I wish Jefferson had said state and church. He didn't, because that wasn't what he was addressing. However, state does not equal Congress. I know that, you know that, and the Supreme Court knows that, but they don't rule that way. It just doesn't mean the same thing. Again, defined by the Constitution, Congress means the Senate and the House. The court has no power, no authority to change the meaning of that word defined by the Constitution. Yet it did. So it is Congress that is limited, not the state, not the church, by the First Amendment. 156 years later, in Emerson versus Board of Education, 1947, Justice Hugo Black wrote, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, the clause against establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. Church and state. 150 years later, he says, remember earlier it was said they are just as well as authoritative, and now it's as though they're in the Constitution themselves. They are not in the Constitution. No one would be more surprised at this conclusion than perhaps Thomas Jefferson himself. He was replying to a letter by the Danbury Baptist Association, which was seeking assurance from the President Jefferson, which was newly elected. He was replying to their letter because they were concerned about the government intruding into the church. He said, I contemplate with sovereign reverence the act of the whole American people, which declare that their legislator would make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting free exercise thereof. He quotes the Constitution. This building a wall of separation between church and state. Now that's where the words appear. The first time they appear. And they are totally unheard of, in essence, for a number of years, till like 1890 or 79. And then 156 years later, again, they come forth, as though they are established law in the Constitution, which they are not. Again, the church was concerned about government intruding into the church business. Jefferson says, in my administration, in essence, we will abide by the words of the Constitution. And it says Congress shall not. And so we will not be intruding. It is as though there is a wall that says Congress shall not pass. It didn't say that Congress couldn't recognize God, for they always have. And they still do to a sense. Now, adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, Jefferson goes on, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all the natural rights. See, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to social duties. So there, he saw, again, government being restricted, not the church, not religion, government. And so he would not intrude, again, to those natural rights. His sentiment was to prohibit Congress, not the church. However, in 1962, Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart was not aided by the uncritical invocation of the metaphor like the wall of separation, referring to Jefferson, a phrase nowhere found in the Constitution. A Supreme Court judge understood the problem. It had created a monster where government actually restricted religion because it somehow associated the school teacher who led her class in prayer with Congress. They confused the word. 23 years later, from 1962. In 1985, Chief Justice William Rehnquist lamented that unfortunately, the Establishment Clause has been expressly freighted with Jefferson's misleading metaphor for nearly 40 years. He understood the problem and the danger of misapplying Jefferson's words. Admittedly, what Jefferson wrote and what the Baptist Conference wrote in their letter to him and his letter to them, it's difficult to follow as I read it. It's again, a different time and a different way of putting words. But it has been understood. Attention has been called from time to time to this problem of taking a phrase from a letter and giving it authority in the Constitution. It has not served us well. Does the Congress have the right to restrict freedom of speech? Well, there are some ways. For instance, it has been ruled, and I forgot who did this, maybe Oliver Wendell Holmes, said something like, no, you're not free to say fire in a theater, or in a church building, for instance, filled with people. You can't say fire because you're going to hurt people when there is no fire. So you don't have that freedom. So yes, there is some ways in which free speech is prohibited. But that doesn't mean in every way. To be tax exempt. And I have these in here because it's going to be a problem in our future. To be tax exempt under Section 501, the Internal Revenue Code, an organization, this is what they say, an organization such as the Church at Barnes, must be organized and operated exclusively for exempt purposes set forth in Section 105, and none of its earnings may inure, and that would be to the benefit, to any private or stockholder or individual. It's a non-profit thing. In addition, it may not be an action organization. It may not attempt to influence legislation as a substantial, I had to call that word to your attention, part of its activities, and it may not participate in any campaign activity for or against political candidates. The First Amendment restricts Congress. Congress restricted religion. They restricted our freedom of speech, granted to us in the First Amendment to the Constitution. If the First Amendment to the Constitution prohibits Congress from prohibiting the free exercise thereof of religion, or abridging the freedom of speech, and it does, how can Congress then take it away? Remember, Congress cannot make a law that goes against or violates the Constitution. It has no such authority. And the First Amendment gives us, as religious people, certain rights. And years later, Congress has no business, no authority to take away those rights. No law passed by Congress can legally take away a constitutional or Bill of Rights right. They are supreme in this nation. They are above any other man-written laws. The only law that passes them is God's. We do have a means by which we can change our Constitution, and it is laid out in the Constitution, and we can change the Bill of Rights, but certain things are required. 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House and 3/4 of the states have to approve it. Congress cannot change the Constitution at will. The Supreme Court cannot change the Constitution legally. And yet it does. And so has our Congress. The prohibition against participation in political campaign came about, might surprise you, in 1954, not in 1791. When Congress amended without debate and without analysis the Internal Revenue Code 501 to restrict the speech of non-profit tax-exempt entities, including churches. Tomorrow night we're going to hear about homosexuality and same-sex marriage. And believe me, as Marion has said on a number of occasions, we are in for some trouble because those words, to talk against them is going to be labeled hate speech, and when you talk about them, you're subject to penalty. You're subject to being found guilty and put in jail. It's coming, unless people with integrity step forward and stop it. So what are we talking about? Congress enacted a law, but now remember, Congress cannot enact a law that it violates the Constitution. But they did. They took away, by giving us a carrot, tax exemption, our freedom of speech. Before the amendment was passed, there was no restrictions on the churches, on what churches could or could not do with regard to speech about government and voting or anything else prior to 1954. I'm not going to get into politics, but I challenge you to go on your internet and find out who was in control of the Congress in 1954. May it be noted, traditionally, churches through American history have been the most conservative voices heard. Now, who would want to constrict or restrict conservative voices? You deal with that. We must be willing to stand as churches of Christ. Some wise man said, we tax what we desire to reduce. Churches, here's a carrot, will not tax you. But if you decide to speak where we tell you not to, we will. And we'll reduce your speech. Unless you think freedom of speech is more important than tax exemption. Whatever the Congress and the IRS may do with our tax exempt status to limit our speech, the Churches of Christ must be determined to teach the truth on all biblical subjects, whatever they are. As Peter said, we ought to obey God rather than men. Our founding fathers, the Supreme Courts, and the Congress are men. We have a higher obligation and a higher duty. Man is social and political in character. That's just the way we are. That's we're hermits. In the bond of communion, it is the duty of mankind to God to be obedient to the gospel of Christ. In the bond of civil government, it is the obligation of mankind to society. We have both obligations, and we are to render to Caesar that which belongs to Caesar, and to God that which belongs to God. God is always superior. But we have both obligations. Citizenship in the state and the civil government stands on the relationship of men to a political arrangement through a civil compact that creates a civil government and is subject to change. That's the nature of civil government. It's subject to change, and our founding fathers gave the means by which we could change it. On the other hand, the church is a spiritual order which is not subject to alteration. A kingdom which cannot be moved, and a faith which cannot be changed. And we as churches of Christ must understand this truth. The state is a human order subject to the will of the people. Remember, it is of the people, for the people, and by the people. And its laws are subject to amendment and appeal according to the wishes of the people and the desires of our elected office holders. But Jesus said to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. He was making a declarative statement showing the contrast of the nature of the imperial kingdom which Pilate represented and the spiritual kingdom which Christ had come to establish. My kingdom, he said, is not of this world. I so appreciated David's lesson. It's good to have just before this one. Finally, we must understand the church, the individual Christian, and civil government are at their best when each remains in the role which God ordained. It shouldn't be mixed. The churches of Christ must preach the truth on all subjects without fear, while not shunning to declare all the counsel of God. Individual Christians and voting, this always comes up. I want to say the individual votes, the Christian teach, or the church teaches. Don't confuse the two. The individual Christian must take part in civil government, being a good citizen, by taking part in local activities, and by voting for the person who best stands for the New Testament precepts or principles. Don't stay at home. Go vote for the person who represents New Testament principles the best. Otherwise, we're going to get the worst. All civil laws are passed into law by the demands of the citizens, but must be voted into law by the civil servants, the elected office holders. So those we vote for and elect, they're going to make the laws. Now they may or may not pay any attention to us, but we have to choose and look for the better of what we have. There are individual obligations. Citizens are demanded of those for whom they vote, or citizens must demand of those for whom they vote and elected office holders that they work toward passing into civil laws that are compatible to God's moral laws. They're in two different realms, but they can be the same thing. Murder is wrong. God said so. And if our government is going to be civil, it also has to say so. And on it goes. Never in my lifetime, which is 72 years, have we as a nation stood more in danger of becoming more uncivil and more immoral than we have at the present time. I'm sure that could be said by others who have gone before me at different times, because there have been some very bad times in history. But in my lifetime, a short 72 years, I think this is true. That the individual Christian fulfills civil responsibilities and the church fulfill hers. And so in conclusion, let me give you this, and this is it. And now, brethren, I commend you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and to give you an inheritance among them which are sanctified. I could not leave you with anything better. This is God's word. It obligates us. Let the Christian act as a Christian. Let the church be the church. And those obligations are different, but that's the way it is. Should you be here tonight, not a Christian, we encourage you to become part of the greatest institution. Greater than the family, greater than the government. Because as David said earlier, our citizenship is in heaven. If you desire to have a citizenship higher than that of America or any other nation, before our latest fall coming, you can obey the gospel of Christ by believing it, repenting of your sins, confessing Jesus Christ, the Son of God and Lord, and be baptized into water in the name of Jesus Christ. And God will forgive you of your sins. He has promised, and he keeps his promises. As we stand and sing, won't you come at this time? Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?
study.